So it's become very clear in 10th edition that Games Workshop is indeed phasing out the Firstborn line. They've taken away lots of quite niche stuff, but what happens to the rest? Tactical Marines, Rhinos, Land Raiders, and Predator tanks are all staples of 40k. It's the writing on the wall for them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines and the removal of the Firstborn. It seems that we know what's happening for 10th edition now, but given that so many kits will be considered highly at risk by collectors out there, I think it's certainly worth thinking about what happens next time round, what's most likely to stay and what will get removed. Ever since 8th edition came out and Games Workshop released the new Primaris Space Marines, there's been some sense that the writing has been on the wall for the Firstborn since then. Games Workshop's kept up a fairly busy release schedule with more and more Primaris kits, though at the start the removal of Firstborn kits was kind of slow, mainly focusing on a few slightly more niche resin characters or alternative HQ sculpts. Things really ramped up hard in 10th edition though, and Games Workshop made it a bit more obvious that yes, they're not too afraid of pulling some kits that have been around for a very, very long time, with the removal of things like the standard Dreadnought and the Landspeeder. Terminator models were updated to the new scale. There were fairly direct replacements of things like Stern Guard, the Command Squad, and Assault Marines, all at Primaris scale, and some things that had already had near analogues were removed, things like Landspeeders, the Bike Squad, and the Attack Bike. Now they've got options like the Storm Speeder, Outriders, and Invader ATV. Seems that not everything is going to be crossing the Rubicon Primaris though. The Thunderfire Cannon, Ironclad Dreadnought, and Hunter and Stalker don't really have things that are particularly close to them. I guess you could maybe argue the Fire Strike for the Thunderfire. And the way that some things do get some Primaris analogues made and some don't makes it kind of interesting for what happens to the rest of the Firstborn kits, still at least a fairly sizable part of the Space Marine range. For the sum total of the last of the Firstborn within the Space Marine Codex, we've got Tactical Squads, Devastator Squads, and Vanguard Veterans, plus some slightly more heavily armoured Centurions and Assault Terminators, plenty of iconic tanks based on the Rhino chassis, but also the Land Raider Drop Pod and Classic Dreadnought as well, the Space Marine Stormflyers, and several unique characters. In FAQ discussions towards the start of 10th edition, Games Workshop did say that they will remove things that either no longer sell well or no longer fit the theme of the army particularly well that they're trying to create, specifically calling out Tactical Marines as a squad that was still really quite popular and sold well, so they'd be staying for the meantime. They did immediately follow that with the big core of the more niche Firstborn kits though, things like the Thunderfire, Ironclad, Landspeeders, and the Hunter and Stalker, and it seems likely that further similar cuts are going to happen at some point in the line. It's not just the core codex as well, I guess all of the divergent chapters will have their own reckonings, particularly when they get their Primaris releases. Some of those might be welcome if they get some cool miniature updates, some perhaps less so if they just get things removed without replacements. For this video though, I thought it would just be interesting to talk through each one of the remaining Firstborn kits and what their status is at the moment. And just for a bit of opinion polling, I decided to ask you what you thought the chances of them being outright removed would be, and then also a quick follow-up question to ask how you think they would be removed, whether they would be directly replaced with no war gear changes, or have a near Primaris analogue, or just removed without replacement at all. I'll admit I do have a bit of a vested interest in this one. I own just about one of every single unit that's going to be mentioned here. I must admit my tank-heavy Firstborn army isn't necessarily looking forward to 11th edition and whatever Games Workshop decides to do with it. Jumping into the squads and tanks though, first up we have the Assault Terminators. These guys were understandably voted as basically the lowest chance of disappearance without replacement, ranking among the lowest with 27% there. Kind of understandable for that one really. We have seen that Games Workshop have updated the regular Terminator squad. It was more of a surprise than anything that they didn't update the Terminator Assault squad at the same time, but this just feels like a really easy safe release for them at some point in the future. People have been near guaranteed to love bigger, badder Terminators with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields or Lightning Claws. I think it seems about as safe as anything that these guys are going to remain pretty similar when they're updated. Like the regular Terminator squad, I think there's a reasonable chance they just don't even get any war gear changes or anything like that and just stay as is. At the other end of the spectrum though, for Space Marine squads, people are most concerned about the Tactical Marines and the Devastators. They were voted as a 62% chance just to be removed without a direct replacement to them. So basically some of the miniatures that are most likely to vanish and not be able to be used anymore. I guess arguably these guys already do have their Primaris replacement pretty much, the standard Intercessor squad and the Desolation squad. The Intercessors definitely feel like a different sort of offering to the Tactical Marines though. They don't get any special weapons barring a grenade launcher, though even since the squad release they have got more Sergeant war gear options due to upgrade sprues that Games Workshop released. At the back of my mind I do wonder if at some point Games Workshop might re-release the Intercessors with some options for heavy or special weapons in the future, and make the full replacement complete, but I feel like that's very much not guaranteed. I also don't think that people would see the Desolation Squad as a direct replacement for the Devastators either. They certainly fit in the same battlefield role, but those weird missile launchers they have do feel very different. I feel like they're perhaps a case where there is still the room for both of them in the line. Even if you do have Desolation Marines, I don't think that would really stop Games Workshop from releasing a new and upscaled Primaris Devastator squad with a more fun and flexible choice of weapons. Might be a case kind of similar to the Terminators, when it sort of felt like the Aggressors might have been the spiritual successor to them when they first came out, but given fan reactions and feelings it was clear that they just didn't really feel the same, so there's plenty of room for both Aggressors and Terminators, despite both being heavily armed infantry with bolt weapons and power fists. From the channel vote, people seem to be a lot more split on the Tactical Marines than Devastators. A good number of people did seem to think that they would definitely get a pretty direct replacement, whereas lots of people seem to think that they absolutely won't besides the Intercessors. Moving on, we've got the Vanguard Veterans. People were a bit more split on these guys, marking them as a roughly 50% chance of going away with no replacement. I feel like these guys are probably another quite clear case that they're going to be handled similar to the Stern Guard Veterans. Games Workshop just literally released an updated kit for them with Primaris scaling, and given that they don't have a Jump Veteran kit for the Primaris yet, just seems that there'd be no reason that they wouldn't do the same. They wouldn't need to update the naming or anything like that, though I feel like there's at least a reasonable chance they could change around war gear options. If they're handled like a few other Primaris kits, you might see a choice between two different weapons, as opposed to a whole mix of different options. In the follow-up polling question, people seem to agree with that, saying that they're likely to get a similar Primaris replacement, as opposed to the next two options, which were a direct replacement, or just being removed with no replacement. Next up, as another bit of an oddity within the line, are the Centurions. They seem to have been rated by you guys as just a little bit likely to disappear with no replacement coming. Somewhat middling overall, and people are very evenly split as to what might happen to them, whether they go away, whether they get an updated replacement, or whether they'll just remain on sale and not be replaced. I must admit they feel unlikely to actually get a Primaris style update to me with different scaling or anything like that. They're already really quite big, chunky and involved infantry kits, and they are quite recent miniatures as well. I feel like perhaps the most worrying thing for them is they sort of come from the same sort of era as things like the Hunter and Stalker tanks, perhaps a bit like Space Marine Advanced Tech in a similar way to Thunderfire Cannons, Ironclads, or those, which almost seem to be a bit of an add-on to the Space Marine range more than anything else, and they don't tend to make huge appearances consistently in the lore. As at least a fairly recent kit, I feel like there's no major reason for them to be in a rush to remove these guys. Being big chunky suits of armour, it's kind of hard to tell whether or not they're really fitting to the same Primaris scale, so that's not really the biggest issue for those. But on the other hand, being a recent kit wasn't enough to stop the Hunter and Stalker tanks from going away and getting their rules sent to Legends. I do think it would be pretty painful if Games Workshop just suddenly retired the Centurions though. They are pretty enormously expensive models for the three that you get, and fairly recent plastic too. Onto the tanks and vehicles, and we'll start with perhaps some of the most iconic stuff first. The Land Raider was voted by you guys as a kit that's most likely to remain and not get updated, voted pretty much joint with the Terminators as least likely to be replaced, perhaps partly due to just how much of an iconic tank it is for the 40k setting. I think it would be a bit of a tragedy to lose such an iconic 40k tank really, and while the Primaris do arguably already have their Land Raider analogue in the Repulsor, it really just doesn't feel the same in any way. A very different big armoured hover transport tank covered in guns. It is interesting that at least broadly across Warhammer 40k when kits get updated, tanks don't tend to be the ones that receive the most attention for new releases. I guess perhaps part of the reason, unless they get ridiculously old and dated, is that they just might not add all that much by re-releasing them. Infantry, I feel like maybe the difference between the technical model making abilities that they've had has actually caused them to come on some way since the update, but with tanks they're quite big and blocky, and it's more important the overall theme and look of the vehicle as opposed to the razor fine modelling. It means that there's really quite old miniatures like the Hammerhead gunship for the Tau or the Eldar Falcon Grav tank. They've not seen updates in ages, and short updates would be nice for them, but they don't feel quite as necessary as some of the older infantry kits for those factions. My guess would be that at some point Games Workshop might redo the Land Raider, but maybe just slightly change the aesthetics a bit so it can be crewed by Primaris. I'd guess that it might not be as high a priority as most of the infantry kits though. In a similar sort of vein, a unit that people aren't really expecting to lose is the drop pod. This one again was voted as one of the very least likely to be removed without replacement. I guess partly that, as with Land Raiders, it's hard to imagine Space Marines not having access to drop pods. It is one of their most iconic ways of making war, striking from the sky in their battle barges. Voting beyond that was kind of split as to exactly what would happen with them, whether it would be a similar Primaris unit released, or just no replacement and leave as is. I guess the little seats and straps and things aren't really enormously well scaled to Primaris Space Marines, but on the other hand, for a slightly unexciting model that's basically just a pod with a bunch of straps in, I'm not 100% sure if anyone would really care all that much. It seems kind of hard to imagine that a Primaris scale update would really add loads for people, and in all honesty, if they did update it, I'd kind of hope that Games Workshop doesn't try and do anything to make it too weird, different, or exciting. I feel like often when they redo models, they might feel the need to bolt on a whole load of extra guns or make it do something weird and different that you're not expecting. I think a nice simple transport vehicle is good enough, really. Its main purpose should be getting Space Marines from A to B, and not paying for loads of additional value of one sort or another. I will say that the kit's maybe a bit of a miserable one to assemble, not really the easiest to glue together, nor the easiest to paint with a ridiculous amount of surfaces. I must admit I've had one sitting on my shelf for really quite a long time, around about 50% finished. Most of the outside is done, but I can't really face to paint the inside flaps, particularly when there's at least some chance the miniature might be either removed or updated. I'm not sure I can face that amount of work for that kind of letdown. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the Space Marine Dreadnought. This one is now the Venerable Dreadnought kit that stands in for the standard Dreadnought datasheet, and this one's viewer voted perhaps one of the most likely vehicles to disappear, with a 61% chance from you guys. To an extent, it's kind of a surprise that it's still around, given that the standard version of the Dreadnought and the Ironclad both went away, but the Venerable Dreadnought kind of unaccountably remains. As Dreadnought minis go, I think it is a nice enough miniature, and with the Venerable sort of appearance, it's not impossible that at some stage in the future we might see a Venerable Redemptor Dreadnought get released. That definitely feels like it could be a way that they go with that chassis, or maybe the same for an Ironclad or Siege type version of the Redemptor as well. Again, I really could see those as being pretty obvious options for future Space Marine releases, though they might be a long time away yet. I would agree though that I find it hard to imagine that this guy's going to last into the distant future, being basically the last Castaferum Dreadnought left for the core Codex Space Marines. It does seem that Games Workshop have broadly decided that the standard Space Marine Dreadnought should be Redemptor scale now. Otherwise for vehicles though, that leaves us with all of the Rhino chassis tanks. I feel like these ones are perhaps some of the most uncertain and most unease inducing out of the Space Marine replacements. I feel like it's kind of unclear exactly how Games Workshop handles them, though wholesale removal definitely seems possible. You guys voted it as a little bit less likely to go, at least compared with some of the other options like Tactical Marines or Devastators, at least without a new update of some kind. But then on the other hand, it is a distinctly Firstborn tank and doesn't really fit amazingly well into the Primaris range. It seems likely that there's going to do something with it at some point, though it might not necessarily be super soon. Again, like maybe the Land Raider and the Drop Pod, the Rhino is one of the more recognisable Space Marine vehicles. They even have that great big one parked outside of Warhammer World. On top of that, as well as being a Space Marine vehicle, it is also a base vehicle for plenty of other factions out there. Chaos Space Marines of all flavours use it, plus the Grey Knights, Custodies, Sisters of Silence, and I guess Inquisitors have in the past. It is rather ubiquitous, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't be removed for the Space Marine faction in specific, but that honestly would feel rather weird to me. The core faction that the Rhino is perhaps most known for not being able to be fielded by them. As a miniature, it is rather iconic, though I would say it's maybe always scaled a bit weirdly. I guess there's always a bit of suspension of disbelief, as with the drop pod perhaps, but there doesn't really look like there's enough room for 10 Space Marines in power armour or within that rather tiny hold of the Rhino. Never mind when the Space Marines are great big hulking Primaris Marines, bigger and bulkier than they were before, and now in theory you can fit 12 of them in there. I'm maybe not too surprised as a result that the Impulsor was chosen to be able to transport 6 Primaris rather than 12, despite being a fairly similar sized vehicle. Speaking of which, if Games Workshop did want, I guess the Primaris already have their workhorse transport vehicle in the Impulsor, so that might be one thing that puts the Rhino more at risk than anything else. It definitely works kind of differently as a faction transport though, not being able to take 10 Marines in it is kind of big. The Impulsor does maybe feel more similar to a Razorback though, which people feel is far more at risk than the Rhino. Maybe that's partly because the Rhino feels like the base tank, and the Razorback feels like the bolt-on upgrade kit for it, with las cannons or heavy bolters on top. As mentioned, perhaps more so than the Rhino, it does feel like the Impulsor is the spiritual successor to the Razorback. That very much is a transport where you can mount various choices of heavy weapons on top, whether it's missile launchers, the Iron Hail Sky Talon array, or having more durability with a shield dome. From the follow-up breakdown, it does look like people are just expecting the Razorback at some point to be removed with no replacement whatsoever. I guess it really does depend on whether or not they decided that the Rhino was important and iconic enough to re-release a new Rhino kit and just make it more Primaris scaling but keep the overall aesthetic the same. I guess if they decided to go with that line of thinking, then it would seem pretty likely that the Razorback could even be incorporated into that same kit. If not though, I would agree it's probably just going to get removed. It does seem like Games Workshop have got quite a big decision there where they really could go either way. Again, that perhaps could have follow-on consequences for the Predator tanks. You guys seem to have ranked them between the Rhino and the Razorback, more at risk than the Rhino, though less than the Razor. And again, these guys are another pretty iconic unit of the Marines. I remember one featuring in the original Dawn of War animation, blasting apart some orcs with twin las cannons. Again, it's pretty iconic, maybe one of the other best known tanks besides the Rhino and the Land Raider overall. And again, it's used for several Chaos Space Marine legions as well. Perhaps the most worrying thing for the Predator is, again, it does basically already have a Primaris equivalent. The Gladiator tanks are just pretty much a Predator but Hover and Primaris. Different gun variations, of course, and slightly different battlefield roles, but still basically a similar sort of medium battle tank with sponsons and a big turret. They really don't feel too far away. If it does choose to get removed, then it was heavily voted by you guys that it's likely to get no further replacement as a result, I think. Basically, if Games Workshop decides that the day of the Predator for the standard Space Marines is done, then it's Gladiators from here on in. Otherwise, for the last of the Rhino chassis variants, there's the Vindicator and Whirlwind. These guys, I'd argue, are in a slightly different position to the Predator actually, given that they don't really have a Primaris analogue yet. I guess if we see a Gladiator chassis tank with either a rocket artillery system or a siege cannon, then that could be an indication that these guys might not be long for the world. For likelihood of disappearance, people are pretty concerned about them still, around about 50% here. And again, both are pretty well liked and have been around for a very long time, both of them being metal kits before they had these plastic incarnations. For the next logical step in Primaris vehicles, it really does seem that artillery tank and siege tank could be some of the next directions they decide to go with them. Really wouldn't be too surprised to see them crop up at some sort of later release, either mid-10th or 11th. For the polling, people interestingly seem to think that the Whirlwind's more likely to get a similar Primaris replacement compared with the Vindicator for some reason. I must admit I can't help but think that a Vindicator would look kind of odd with an enormous great big siege cannon on a hover chassis. Sort of feel like you need something big and meaty to get the recoil. And compared with the Whirlwind as well, it's a bit more of a recent kit. Definitely doesn't really feel like the sort of model that really needs replacement, or at least should be one of the very last ones to go, hopefully. Again, that didn't stop them from getting rid of the Hunter and Stalker though. Otherwise, we've got the Storm Raven and the other Storm planes, the Storm Talon and the Stormhawk. They were all sort of middling on the same sort of level as the Vindicator and the Whirlwind. And I feel like they probably will be seen as just not really all that important to get any kind of early update. They're blocky Space Marine flyers, and I'm sure that Games Workshop would replace them with something much the same. And given that there's no pintle-mounted firing positions or other things to give them away, you can't really tell what sort of scale the pilot is anyway, so scaling maybe isn't the biggest issue. I feel like for miniature updates, the Storm Talon's always been a bit of a curious miniature. People certainly have likened it to a flying smart car in the past. I must admit, out of the two, I think I'd be far more disappointed to see the Storm Raven gunship get rotated out. I do have one myself, and I just think that the miniature's kind of fun. Basically, as soon as that was released, I was just keen to pick up a Space Marine Mini Thunderhawk pretty much as it's aimed to be. I think it feels pretty appropriate for the faction. Finally, for the core Space Marine Codex, we've got the special characters that still remain yet have Finecast minis. Lysander, Pedro Cantor, Cato Sicarius, and Vulcan Hestan in specific. People seem to be maybe a little bit more bold about these guys, thinking that there's less chance of them just going away now, seeing as Games Workshop have chosen to keep them around, even when some of their miniatures have gone out of print. I still don't think that, given that they're Firstborn and Finecast miniatures, people would be too surprised if they went away. But given that these are perhaps some of the more popular Firstborn characters, they really do feel like they should be first in line for new sculpted miniatures at one point or another. At some stage, getting a plastic kit and a reimagination at the same time, I'm sure that would generally go down well. We did already see Cato Sicarius in Primaris form in artwork really quite a long time ago now. I think that might make him a little bit more likely, and I feel like releases that they could basically have come out at just about any time realistically. It would be cool to see just a little bit more support for the major Space Marine chapters out there rather than just one Primaris character miniature. Overall, it definitely looks like there's some things that are more or less likely to go away without replacements. I feel like given enough time, Games Workshop will slowly phase through all of this in one way or another. Things like Land Raiders, Drop Pods, and Assault Terminators seem like they'd be at least fairly safe to have some sort of miniature representation in the future. Same with Vanguard Veterans in my mind. Maybe the biggest question for me is what they do with the Rhino chassis, whether or not it does just go away for core Codex Space Marines, or whether they release a more Primaris scale update and actually allow the Primaris to get some big vehicles with tracks. Let me know your thoughts on which of these vehicles feel most at risk to you, or which ones you'd like to see updated. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. And I must admit it is just a little bit concerning if you've got quite a few of these already, as I have myself. It certainly puts the dampers on thinking about picking up any more of these, knowing that they're just quite so much in jeopardy in a few years' time. In any case, if you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll hopefully keep plenty of these 40k discussion videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.